Having Dr. Thomas G. Nestor, who is a professor at Bridgewater State University, I'll get that right, of history. He's going to give a presentation on the Battle of the Atlantic. And it's a World War II history, because there was some Atlantic stuff back in World War I, but this is World War II. It was the longest military campaign. It actually started before we even entered the war. So again, with all thing, we'll let Dr. Nestor give his presentation. Dr. Nestor?
All right, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. When Bob Lytle initially contacted me to do the presentation, I'm a Civil War historian, but I teach, obviously, naval history, World War II, American military history, etc. And he said you would be looking for a Revolutionary or a World War II topic, and I proposed the Battle of the Atlantic, not thinking that I've picked one of the longest and most complex military campaigns in the history of war to go ahead and talk about today. So good news is there's a lot of ways to organize this kind of discussion. Bad news is there's a lot of material, obviously, to go ahead and wrangle. So I wanted to go ahead, talk about this mainly because, for me, this truly is the most decisive campaign of World War II. It does not get nearly the amount of attention that Normandy does, right, or North Africa, or Sicily, or Italy, or the Battle of the Bulge, whatever it might be. But as Richard Overy said in his book, Why the Allies Won, there was no land or air campaign that could have occurred without first securing the sea lanes to Europe. Because obviously the military personnel, in terms of aircraft they can fly over, but obviously the bombs they're dropping, the aviation fuel they're using, all that is shipped obviously by ship. So this really was perhaps the most important campaign of World War II. It culminates really in the middle of 1943, ultimately with obviously the Allies gaining the upper hand, and allows time for the buildup for the invasion of Normandy, which really starts to really scale up beginning in the middle of 1943 through the first part of 1944, obviously. So it absolutely is, I think, vital. Oh, I pushed the wrong way. There we go. All right, so I want to go ahead and start with some backgrounds, material and information here. So obviously, there was a U-boat campaign that took place in the Atlantic during World War I. In many ways, it really paled in comparison, however, to what the scale and scope of the U-boat campaigns in the battle that occurred in the Atlantic during World War II. And it is part of what is traditionally in naval history a guerre-de-course military strategy. So in other words, weaker naval powers historically have always used whatever resources they had at hand to go ahead and take on a more powerful navy, right? The United States has historically been the weaker naval power up until about 1900. So always would rely on, for example, first-class frigates to go ahead that were better than any frigate that were being built in Europe, for example. The United States obviously attempted to use a submarine during the Revolutionary War. It wasn't very effective. They also started to use mines, right? Naval mines, or as they were called, torpedoes at the time. So it is very common for weaker naval powers to go ahead and use a guerre-de-course naval strategy, which is essentially a war on commerce. And the submarine campaign is an extension of this strategy. However, it challenges this guerre-de-course naval strategy, because if we think about during the American Civil War, the Confederacy pursued this strategy. And of course, they did it using surface raiders, like the CSS Alabama, all right? But there were rules applied to this. In other words, you stopped a merchant vessel. You ensured that the cargo being carried belonged to a belligerent nation, and then you made provision for the crew before, A, you either sailed the ship into a port to condemn as a prize, or in the case of the Confederacy not having access to a lot of prize courts, they would go and usually burn the ship right there at sea. But you had to make provision for the crew. And this interfered, of course, with the sailing of the Alabama, because eventually you had so many crew members on board that you were looking after that eventually you had to drop them off at a port someplace before you could get back to commerce raiding. So when the Germans start using the submarines to carry out this commerce raiding strategy, of course, especially using unrestricted submarine warfare, it really starts to challenge a lot of these rules for commerce raiding. In other words, they didn't have the space on board to make provision for the crew. If they radioed in a distress call for the crew, they're giving away their position to the enemy. And this was something that the British would obviously use against German U-boats, and so it became customary to simply attack without warning, and of course that sometimes involved neutral vessels, attack without warning and make no provision for the crew, which is ultimately what leads the United States into World War I, right, in April 1917. So, the World War I experience, coming out of this, the Germans are going to learn some really important lessons. And I think a lot of these, number one, strategy and tactics. So first of all, when Karl Dönitz, the German admiral in charge of their U-boat force, when he starts planning how to win this war during World War II, he assumes that he's going to need to have at least 300 U-boats, which would give him 50 operational U-boats at any one given time. And he assumed, based on the World War I average, that each one of those U-boats would have to sink roughly 3 ships a month. And if they did so, that would be greater than the Allies' capacity to go ahead and replace those losses. And you can, in his mind, achieve a decisive result in World War II by winning this Battle of the Atlantic. Now, he encountered a lot of problems, having those 300 U-boats, keeping them committed to the Atlantic. Admiral Eric Raeder had a different viewpoint. He thought surface raiders were more useful than U-boats. So there were a lot of challenges to carrying out this strategy, but eventually Karl Dönitz will get control of it. But what the Germans learn is, number one, the Allies are concentrating their convoys, and so the best use of U-boats in the next war will be to concentrate their U-boats. Concentration versus concentration. Once you find a convoy, you want to go ahead and call in as many U-boats to descend upon that convoy as possible. So keep them in these operational units. In the West, they're known as wolf packs, obviously. The Germans just called it pack tactics. But to go ahead and once one U-boat sighted a convoy, to radio that back to headquarters, and then headquarters would bring in whatever U-boats were in the area to go ahead and descend on this convoys to have the greatest impact in the shortest span of time. So number one, pack tactics, concentration versus concentration, because it's the best way in a wide open ocean to actually find these convoys is to go ahead and use these pack tactics. The other thing they're going to learn is the British do develop ASDIC, which is a form of sonar, obviously, which is making it possible to locate submarines while they're submerged. And so the Germans are going to devise new tactics for the employment of submarines during World War II, which is to attack at night and to attack on the surface. You can have more accurate shots on the surface, and of course, if you're surfaced, you're not going to be able to be found using that ASDEC or sonar system. All right, this is pre-radar, right, obviously, that they're thinking about. So they can attack at night where they're concealed from the enemy on the surface, protected from ASDIC, but also it will give them a better opportunity to have more accurate firing of torpedoes ultimately at the enemy. So these are some of the things that they come out of World War II with. And then I just want to talk about what the Americans forgot, and the British to a certain extent too. The British actually are pretty confident coming out of World War I that they can use this ASDIC system to go ahead and counter the U-boat menace. Right, this comes becomes available for them more widely at the end of World War I. It gives them tremendous confidence that the U-boats will not pose the same threat in World War II that they posed in World War I. They wound up obviously being wrong in that. For the Americans, we forgot about convoying tactics, right, and how useful they can be. The German Navy's, second happy time comes at our expense along the east coast of the United States, due in large part to our refusal to go ahead and convoy boats, which we'll talk a bit more about ultimately later. All right. The other thing that the Americans forgot is how important these escort vessels are. This is something the U.S. also experienced in World War I. Obviously, we were latecomers to World War I, but the U.S. investment was really in capital warships, right? Pursuing that Alfred Thayer Mahan naval strategy, which is the opposite of guerre de course, it's guerre d'escadre, right? So battle fleet actions, right? Scoring a decisive result, one battle fleet against the other. This is more asymmetric warfare. That's more symmetric warfare, obviously. All right, and it's offensive action that they really valued, and so the Americans didn't really appreciate escorting convoys because it was more defensive in nature, and it relied heavily on small ships that they didn't necessarily think were the best or the most desirable ships to have. And so they are going to have to relearn the importance of these smaller escort vessels in anti-submarine warfare. Battleships and aircraft carriers, fleet carriers at least, aren't necessarily going to get it done. All right. Now, the Kriegsmarine is going to be reborn in the 1930s. Obviously, Adolf Hitler is going to renounce the Versailles Treaty in 1935. It's going to be 3 months later, though, when they conclude an Anglo-German naval agreement in June of 1935, that the Germans are going to start rebuilding, right, their navy, and they were allowed to build submarines. They were allowed to build all ships up to 35% of the British Royal Navy's strength. But submarine strength could go up to 45% of what the Royal Navy had. And of course, Britain made this agreement with Germany without consulting any of their allies, which though maybe will rue the day one day that they're going to have this. And in 1938, the Germans are going to invoke the escalator clause in that agreement so that by the time the war begins, they have an equal number of submarines to the British. But it was still far short of the 300 that Dönitz envisioned to carry out a successful and effective U-boat campaign. All right. So for the United States, I think it's important in understanding the significance of this battle this is where the United States gets involved directly in World War II at a very early stage, right, and starts envisioning its entry into the war even before it officially does join. The United States short of war strategy is really going to start to be implemented, and the Neutrality Acts will begin to be revised, especially after the surrender of France on June 22nd of 1940. The United States, this is a psychological blow to the United States because the United States assumed, just like in World War I, that Germany would not be able to defeat France out of hand, and that would enable the United States the time to mobilize, right, and eventually deploy its forces, and also give you a fairly safe place to disembark your troops to move forward into the front line, right, not having an amphibious invasion. So when France fell, that is a psychological blow to the United States. Germany is obviously seen as that much greater of a menace to the peace and security of the United States, and Britain becomes all that much more important. Keeping Britain fighting to serve as that bulwark to allow the United States time to mobilize, all right, and prepare itself ultimately for the war. And Britain in the European theater of operations is going to act very much like Australia does in the Pacific theater, which is you have to have this kind of base, safe base in the theater to build up your forces to prepare to go ahead and launch those attacks against your enemy forces. All right, so keeping Britain in the fight is very important. So aid to Britain is really going to start to escalate in the 1940s, right? So the Destroyers for Bases deal in September of 1940, where the United States exchanges 50 World War I vintage destroyers to help the British battle the U-boat threat in exchange for 99-year leases on British bases in the Western Hemisphere. That's also an important part of, not only did we provide them with the destroyers, but also we're taking on more of the hemispheric defense and allowing Britain to free up more resources, right, to go ahead and wage this war against Germany in the Atlantic, all right? All that aid has to get there to Britain, obviously, across the Atlantic Ocean, all right? And in December, Churchill's going to write a letter to FDR, December 7th of 1940, somewhat ironically, in which he says that Britain has, this is the time of the cash and carry provision, right, the revision to the Neutrality Acts, and basically Churchill said, well, we've got a cash problem, and we've got a carry problem, right? And so we're going to need to have you do something for us. I think, paraphrasing, he even says something along the lines of, you will just give it to us, right? Recognizing that we are fighting for your defense as well. And so later that month, December 17th of 1940, during a press conference at the White House is when FDR gives his garden hose analogy, right? His famous garden hose analogy, like, when your neighbor's house is on fire, would you deny him the use of your garden hose to try and put that fire out? And then on December 29th, later on that year, is when he also decides that the United States will act as the arsenal of democracy. And on January 6th of 1941, the Lend-Lease legislation is introduced to Congress. It's passed on March 11th, and the Lend-Lease Act goes into effect, where the United States is going to lend or lease supplies to the Allies. All right, initially, that's Great Britain. But then when Germany invades the Soviet Union on June 22nd of 1941, that aid is also going to be given to the Soviet Union. Arctic convoying is going to be another demand that's placed on Allied shipping and also escorts. All right, so the United States, acting as this arsenal of democracy, needs to guarantee that the equipment and the supplies can get to Britain to keep them in the fight, obviously. And Britain, as an island nation, half of the food Britain is consuming in 1941 is being imported from overseas, right? Most of its oil is being imported from overseas, and a lot of the mineral used in industrial manufacturing has to be imported from overseas. So ultimately, this is an important lifeline that has to be secured. So you just kind of see how the United States is inching into this war ultimately, and then later in the war, eventually the United States is going to be waging an undeclared war against the German U-boat. The United States begins neutrality patrols as early as 1939, largely confined to the Western Hemisphere, but gradually those neutrality patrols are extended further out into the Atlantic. By 1941, the United States is going to occupy Greenland, and then it's going to occupy Iceland, again, freeing up British personnel and responsibilities, right? But as a way to obviously fight this war. And the United States Navy initially will simply provide, a warning, right? If they encounter a submarine in the Atlantic, they will give a warning, and that will call in the British or the Canadians to go and descend upon them to wage war. Well, the USS Greer incident is when a U.S. destroyer was attacked by a German submarine. Nobody knows for sure, right, who attacked who first, right? But the firing began, and that led to the famous shoot-on-sight order. And the United States was actively waging war against the German U-boats in the Atlantic long before the United States actually declared war. In October of 1941, the United States is going to lose two destroyers to German U-boats, the USS Kearney and the USS Reuben James. So this is a serious shooting war between the United States and Germany in the Atlantic. And interestingly, Gerhard Weinberg writes about this in A World at Arms, in which he says, Hitler envisioned going to war against the United States. But he had a plan, and the plan was defeat France and Britain first, then defeat the Soviet Union, and then eventually turn on the United States. So he didn't want the war right when it was happening. And he did not authorize a greater escalation of the war against the U.S. Navy during this time period. But he was eventually envisioning the war, and of course the shooting war begins even before Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, we're talking about small vessels, small numbers of military personnel. Doesn't have the impact that obviously bombing Hawaii, right, Pearl Harbor, and sinking U.S. battleships is going to have. So Allied strategy and logistics. Obviously, this is one of the most important things when it comes to waging war. I think about when the Russians, I almost said Soviet Union, I'm kind of a child of the Cold War, so I always think of them as the Soviets, right? But when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and I don't know if everyone remembers, there was that long invasion force that was trying to make its way to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, and they ran out of fuel along the way. They had to abandon, obviously, a lot of the convoy. Amateurs study tactics, right? Professionals study logistics, and in modern war for the United States, logistics was essential, not only for preparing for major military operations overseas, but for keeping those major military operations going on. All right, so securing these sea lanes was absolutely vital. The Victory Program was a top secret, basically, plan for how the United States would eventually defeat Nazi Germany once the U.S. eventually entered the war, or if they entered the war. And what they envisioned was a 215 division army. We fell far short of that, only mobilizing 90 divisions, right? 8.7 million men, right, in the military. Now, of course, we're going to go much above that, almost 12 million. And they wanted to see a doubling of U.S. spending, defense spending, up to $150 billion. We actually reached $300 billion. So they didn't necessarily forecast things accurately, but it does give you a sense that keeping almost 12 million military personnel right in operation overseas requires a tremendous amount of logistics support. The United States being the arsenal of democracy, this is something that is celebrated in World War II. Well, that arsenal of democracy and how much we produce here in the home domestic economy isn't going to be terribly significant if we can't make sure that stuff gets to the troops overseas and where it's needed, and our allies, obviously, right? So these supply lines are absolutely vital. And as I mentioned before, Britain is absolutely dependent upon these resources, very heavily dependent upon that Lend-Lease aid that they're getting. There's a few military campaigns, the big ones, that I want to look at in more detail. But Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, right, towards the end of 1942, one of the invasion fleets is going to leave the coast of the United States, right, the first transatlantic invasion since Hernan Cortez's expedition in 1519, but securing that invasion fleet. And for the Germans, if you can sink a cargo full of men at sea and drown them there, that's hundreds or thousands of men you don't have to kill in combat later on. It's a much more efficient and economical way to potentially win the war. the strategic bombing campaign, but also that cross-channel invasion. So I want to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail here real quickly. Starting with Operation Torch, because the U-boat menace bore heavily on the planning for this military operation. All right, so this is going to be the first opportunity for the United States, at least, to get American troops in combat against the Germans as early as possible. Obviously, the United States preferred the cross-channel invasion, but we had to work with our British allies. They didn't think that we could pull it off in 1942. I think they were very much correct about that, but certainly an invasion in 42, even a cross-channel invasion in 43, was going to be heavily dependent upon British military personnel. So that gave them a greater say in basically putting that off. By 1944, it was going to be a much more U.S. military operation. And the U.S. forced, obviously, the cross-channel invasion ultimately in 1944. But you're going to have three task forces. So the Center and Eastern Task Forces, all right, this is going to be the British composition of the invasion. They're going to start out in Great Britain. They're going to have to drastically scale down the North Atlantic convoy system to provide escorts, especially destroyers, to go ahead and escort these troop ships down here. Moving an army of this size is difficult. It requires a lot of sea lift capacity, and they want to make sure that these men are not killed at sea, obviously. That would be devastating to the Allied war effort. They're going to sail a fairly circuitous route, and fortunately they're going to benefit because there are German U-boats, a wolf pack operating kind of in the central Atlantic, which is going to descend on a convoy, SL-125, from Sierra Leone, bound for the United Kingdom. And over the course of several days, October 27th to October 31st of 1942, they're going to wreak havoc on that convoy. And they're going to sink 16 vessels in that convoy. But while they're so focused on that, they don't catch sight of the task forces that are descending. Now, when they pass through the Straits of Gibraltar, Spanish observers are going to note the appearance of this fleet. They're going to report it to the Axis forces, and the German U-boats, there's 9 of them operating in the Mediterranean, concentrating around the island of Malta. Basically, there was a U-boat blockade around the British island of Malta. They thought the convoy was bound for Malta. They weren't even thinking of North Africa. There were also 21 Italian submarines. Those 21 Italian submarines are largely ineffectual. But the 9 German submarines will descend upon the convoy, and the convoy is going to maintain an easterly course as long as possible, and then suddenly make a 90-degree turn and descend into North Africa to go ahead and launch this invasion. The Germans are going to go ahead and they're going to threaten the invasion force, but fortunately the convoy escorts are able to keep them away. All right. The U.S. invasion is going to depart from the eastern coast of the United States, as I mentioned. It's going to rendezvous off Norfolk, Virginia, I believe on October 25th, and they're going to sail across the Atlantic. And that's a long voyage, and obviously there's a big threat of German U-boats. And the United States, especially early in the war, probably cannot suffer the public relations fiasco that might result from the loss of a lot of American troops right at sea ultimately. Fortunately, they're not going to have any problem with the U-boats. They're going to land that invasion force there November 8th of 1942. The Germans will show up by November 11th, and they will sink roughly 6 transport vessels, but most of them had already been emptied of their human and also material cargo, and eventually those submarines are going to be driven off. So fortunately, the submarines do not pose a significant threat to this military operation, but the amount of time the Allies put into concentrating on it, the suspension, temporarily suspending Arctic convoys entirely and drastically scaling down the North Atlantic convoys tells you how deeply they're concerned they are about this. It also tells you something else. They don't have enough escort vessels, even in late 1942, to meet all the demands for these very small vessels. All right? Ooh, almost dropped that. I'm not used to this fine equipment here. We don't have this at BSU. All right. So the strategic bombing campaign, here again, I mean, airplanes fly over, but the bombs and the fuel, that's all brought over by ships. That's all brought over by vessels. And for a very long time, it's really the only thing the Allies are contributing to defeating Nazi Germany. It's the second front in Europe. It didn't convince the Soviets, obviously, that it was a true second front in Europe, but for a long time, it's one of the few ways that the Allies, the Western Allies, are actually striking back. After the United States joined the war, of course, we have the combined bomber offensive. This is round-the-clock bombing of Nazi Germany. This is a lot of bombs. This is a lot of fuel. And, of course, the air crew will fly over with the aircraft. But think about all the parts for maintenance, right? Think about all the support personnel, all the vehicles used on airfields to haul bomb loads around and things like that. All that's got to be shipped over. All right. So you really don't even get a strategic bombing campaign without securing the Atlantic sea lanes, right? Because only sea lift has the capacity to transport this much weight, this much war material. So the transportation plan, that's another one I think is important to take note of, because they're going to divert U.S. and British strategic bombers for several months leading up to the Normandy invasion to bomb the transportation infrastructure of Belgium and northern France. They scattered their bombings, obviously, so they would not divulge where they planned to actually invade. They did such an effective job that even for the Allies, it's going to take months for them to rebuild the destruction on this transportation system. So the transportation system is essential to the effectiveness and the success of the Normandy campaign, which is also heavily dependent upon the success in the Battle of the Atlantic, right? Overall, during World War II, so there's 364,484 sorties against Nazi Germany. All right, tremendous amount of aviation fuel, dropping approximately 2.7 million tons of ordnance. That's a lot of weight, and that's a lot of material that has to be transported across the Atlantic. And of course, it's a lot that the American economy produced, but again, it's got to get there and get to the troops in combat to be effective. All right. The cross-channel invasion, I think this is a kind of a great example. So I've got, some of the operational names. So Bolero was the plan to build up for an invasion in 1943. That will obviously be going on, but that buildup is going to go a lot more slowly than they envisioned initially. Of course, the Americans especially kind of start conducting military operations in the Pacific a little bit sooner. Roundup was the original planned 43 invasion. That will be canceled in favor of Overlord, which is, of course, the 44 invasion. But there was also a planned emergency landing in 42. But I like this graph here because you can see really when the United States and Great Britain starts to assemble the invasion force for Operation Overlord, it matches pretty consistently with the dates we're going to be looking for when the Allies get the upper hand, roughly in the middle of 1943 in the Battle of the Atlantic. The buildup for the Normandy invasion is going to really begin largely after the Allies get the upper hand over the German U-boats in the Atlantic in the middle of 1943. Winning that Battle of the Atlantic, or at least getting the upper hand in that battle, is going to be essential for launching this Normandy invasion, which is essential for winning the war from the Allies' perspective, the Western Allies' perspective. So, one of the things, and as a military historian, I think this is true. We like to talk about Napoleon. We like to talk about decisiveness in battle. We like to talk about just scoring these tremendous victories without tremendous sacrifice. But the reality is, in most military campaigns, it does come down to attrition, right? A long struggle to wear them down. And nothing was more of an attrition battle than the Battle of the Atlantic. It really comes down, as I've got in my bullet point down there, production versus destruction. Can we sink more Allied shipping faster than they can build it, than they can replace it? Can we destroy and sink more U-boats, right, faster than the Germans can replace them? And this is basically what it all comes down to. And I can't remember the exact quote, but Winston Churchill at one point says that he would have preferred an invasion to the endless charts and data, right, of the Battle of the Atlantic, that all this was mind-numbing, right? It was so essential to winning the war, but he would have rather confronted Operation Sea Lion, right, the proposed Nazi invasion of Great Britain, than have to deal with something like this. He also said in his memoirs that the only thing that ever really scared, now this is probably hyperbole a little bit, right, but he says the only thing that really scared him in World War II was the submarine threat, right? My guess is if you asked him that during World War II, he might have said something a little bit different, right? But later on, he said it was the submarine threat. So this attrition strategy, this is what the Germans are pursuing from the very beginning. This is what they learned from World War I. This is what they were pursuing in World War I. And they're going to use those pack tactics, right, the Rudeltaktik, to go ahead and achieve that, hopefully more effectively. So the strategy overall is the Tonnengeschlacht, right, which is a tonnage strategy. And ultimately, the initial goals are going to be 100 to 200,000 tons a month, but eventually it's going to reach 700,000 tons a month. This is a lot of shipping they're trying to sink. And this is why Dönitz felt that you absolutely had to have at least 300 U-boats. And he didn't want these U-boats running up to the Arctic, operating in the Mediterranean, operating in the South Atlantic. He wanted them all concentrated in what he viewed as the decisive theater for this battle, which was the North Atlantic. That was the most important theater, and unfortunately for a long time, up until the beginning of 1943, he's not going to be able to control the distribution of the German U-boat fleet. He's going to run into problems with obviously Eric Rader, but he's also going to run into problems with OKW, right, the Oberkommando Wehrmacht, which is going to make decisions about where these submarines are threat well above ultimately his ability to go ahead and impact. But that was the goal. The Rudel tactique, as we mentioned, or as I mentioned before, this is those wolf pack tactics to go ahead and mass force to sink as many ships as possible. If you have a lone submarine wandering around the Atlantic, I mean, these convoys can be up to 5 square miles of ocean. I mean, if you sight a convoy, you're in great shape, but the Atlantic is a big ocean. And if you don't sight, it can be weeks. You might never, on a patrol, you might not see any. And a patrol could last up to 40 days roughly. So you might not see any. So being able to concentrate your force to attack the enemy's concentration, the convoys, going to make it that much more effective. And so, as you can see, I think that this shows you the primary. Sorry, I'm walking, Don. I know this is probably something I'm not supposed to do, but I can't help myself. But as you can see here, I mean, obviously, this shows you the outer layer of Allied air power, and aircraft are very good at picking up, obviously, submarines. This area here that's shaded in is what's known as that North Atlantic, right, air gap. This is a place where the U-boats really preferred to operate because this is where they could have the most important effect. This is where many of the major shipping lanes between the United States, between North America, Canada, and the United States, and Great Britain are obviously going to flow. All right, and this is where you're going to hopefully have your greatest success. And as you can see, the bar graphs are a little cloudy here. They look a little bit better on my computer. But ultimately, you can see here, these are German U-boat sinkings. And as you can see, 1942, things start to ramp up. By 1943, you're really reaching critical proportions here. All right? And then by 1944, those losses are still going to stay very high. We're going to talk about why that is in just a minute. But U-boat losses, they're going to scale up slowly, but once they do scale up, they're going to stay pretty high. And it's going to be really costly to the Germans, not only in U-boats, but also in the personnel, the experienced captains, effective captains. Those are a lot of difficult losses to make up for Germany. And here you can see on this side is the tonnage that they're sinking. And of course, as you can see, 1942 is going to be a really big year. This is the year that the Germans added the 4th rotor to the Enigma machine, the naval Enigma machine, the year of the Great Blackout, when the Allies were not able to read some of these communications, right, about submarines to figure out where they are, and it was tremendously costly. But 1943 is really the decisive year. All right, and as you can see, there's another, because they're going to crack back into the Enigma code in March of that year, which is going to give them the ability to read that. And as you can see, they're going to start to level off. But these losses, even these bars here, are high. But gradually over time, the Allies are able to replace those losses. All right, they're able to make good on them. Eventually, they're going to be outproducing. The U.S. economy is going to be outproducing Germany's ability ultimately to sink these ships. All right, so. Did I get everything? Sorry. The tide turns, yeah, we'll talk more about that. So how did the Allies win? Here are the main factors, as far as I can see it, right, in my opinion. So number one, intelligence. All right, we're going to go each one of these in more detail, but intelligence. And not just the decrypts of the Enigma machine and Bletchley Park, which has gotten so much attention, but also more traditional forms of intelligence, like radio traffic, right, and using Huff-Duff technology to figure out where the German U-boats potentially are. Tactics. They're going to develop much more effective convoy tactics. A lot of that has to do with numbers of escort vessels, but also how they're used and utilized. Technology, and I would say the two most critical technologies for the Allies are going to be weapons and detection. All right, more effective weapons to attack U-boats once they're discovered, but also more sophisticated, more advanced detection systems. And the Allies definitely have an advantage there. Industry. Craig Simmons, right, the great naval historian, in his history, the naval history of World War II, argues that industry was the single most important factor, that producing more than the Germans can sink was the most important factor. For me, it's hard to really pick one thing, but I think it's notable that Craig Simmons, who's a fantastic naval historian, picks that. And then air power, right? Having enough aircraft, having long-range aircraft, but especially having ultimately escort carriers, so that by late 1943 into 1944, virtually every convoy had their own escort carrier attached, which means they had constant air cover. That mid-Atlantic air gap no longer exists. So let me go and look at these in more detail here. So intelligence, that is a picture of the bomb machine depicted there. I wish I could explain the technology about all this to you. I absolutely cannot. They had a computer. It was an early electromagnetic computer, and it helped them detect and break these codes within 36 hours, right? Breaking the code 3 weeks later isn't really going to be important or effective to you. Getting through and breaking the code and figuring out what the information is sooner makes that more useful intelligence ultimately. All right, so they will have the ability to break it down within 36 hours ultimately. The Germans had invented this Enigma machine, and they thought it was impregnable. It was actually a business device developed in Germany during the 1920s, so that you could have basically encrypted business communications. But the German military is going to quickly see the military significance of this, and Polish intelligence, before World War II begins, is actually going to buy an Enigma machine so they can start cracking the code, because they figured out, yeah, the Germans are probably going to be using this in the next war. And obviously there's been a lot of animosity directed towards the Poles, so they thought, let's get a head start on this. Now, they make a huge contribution. They start breaking the code, and they're going to share that intelligence with the British. And that's going to give the British a bit of a leg up, a head start, so to speak, and ultimately cracking through the code. It's going to be, right, the crypto analysts and the scientists and the academics at Bletchley Park, right, the British Code and Cipher School there at Bletchley Park, who will build the bomb machine that can enable them to go ahead and read this. But even breaking the code relies on a lot of things. I mean, number one, they had to have an Enigma machine, right? And they capture one off a U-110 off the coast of Greenland, right, in 1941. So getting that Enigma machine gives them a leg up. But that Enigma machine had 3 rotors, and each one of those rotors had 26 different settings for a letter. And so number one, you had to know what rotors were being used, in what order, and what the settings were for that day. And so that's like 26 possibilities times 26 times 26. It's over 17,000 different possibilities. And then they would put the letter for the message into a 4-letter cluster to make it that much harder to figure out what the message was. They will eventually break through this code and figure it out. They had to have that Enigma machine. They also had to have, obviously, this computer to help them do it. But ultimately, when the Germans add that 4th rotor, which adds another 26, right, possible combinations there, it's going to lead to what's known as the Great Blackout, which is from February of 1942 to, I think the date is March 19th of 1943. When they crack back in. And we saw the U-boat statistics there, the amount of sinkings they had during this critical time. Losing this intelligence is obviously huge. Now, the British, as I mentioned, are using more traditional forms of intelligence gathering, right? Listening to radio signals, trying to use sightings to catch U-boats, especially as they left the Atlantic harbors, right, on the French Atlantic coast and passed through the Bay of Biscay. They were running air patrols over that, trying to figure out, because if you can pick up one of these U-boats, maybe you can go ahead and start tracking it. And interestingly, the Germans were so convinced that you could not crack into the Enigma machine that Karl Dönitz assumed that they were using some version of long-range radar to track his U-boats. Didn't even settle on the idea that the Enigma machine had been broken ultimately. But again, the submarine tracking room is going to use also lots of traditional forms of intelligence. This is something I think that is also important to keep in mind. It's not just Bletchley Park and the Enigma machines and the breaking this code. There's all kinds of things they are doing to figure out where these submarines are, where they're operating, so that they can go ahead and avoid them. And the submarine tracking room in the Admiralty is going to help go ahead and do this. And the Germans had their own, B-Dienst, on the other end. And they were using, because they had actually cracked the Allied code, they cracked into the Royal Navy's number 3 cipher, and the British didn't know it, right? And so they're reading a lot of this British traffic, which is helping them. The only thing that really helps the escorts or the convoys is that they're under radio silence across the entire Atlantic. They're not sending messages. But those Rudel tactics that the Germans are relying on requires them to send very brief radio messages back to headquarters in Europe indicating where they found a convoy. Now, they want to keep those transmissions as short as possible, so they've divided the North Atlantic into grids, and they've assigned codes to those grids so they can send a very short code, Enigma, right, encrypted, to go ahead. But in doing so, they're eventually going to also reveal the location, especially when the Allies start developing that Huff-Duff technology to follow them. But the Germans have to reveal their locations to carry out those Rudel Taktik. And on the other side, B-Dienst, really, they're going to use intelligence gathering to figure out where the convoys are assembling and maybe when they're leaving. and they're going to use a lot of traditional forms of intelligence. But across the Atlantic, these convoys are under strict radio silence. The convoys communicate using traditional flags and lights. And so this makes it really difficult, obviously, for B and D's to ultimately follow these once they're at sea. The tactics. Obviously, the Allies knew that convoying worked. The thing about convoying was, of course, originally in World War I, they thought, well, if we have a bunch of ships sailing individually, right, it's going to be that much harder to find a single ship in the Atlantic. And the experience in World War I was, especially as slow as some of these ships move, yeah, when they do catch them, they sink them. So that's kind of a problem. Whereas if we can go ahead and cluster them together, if we can get an entire convoy through these dangerous waters, we're delivering that much more war material, right? And if we keep them, I mean, just kind of like, herd tactics, right, when it comes to wildlife, that ultimately you can better protect. And you can also husband your limited resources when it comes to escorts, right, guarding these ships to protect them. And this is why the Germans are going to use concentration against concentration ultimately, all right? Early on in the war, they don't have enough escorts to escort these ships across the ocean. There's certainly not enough destroyers to go around. Destroyers are needed everywhere all the time. The British are going to suffer significant losses at Dunkirk and at Norway in the loss of some of these destroyers. So they're going to have to start building a lot of ships like the corvettes, which Churchill called cheap and nasties, right? That can serve this function ultimately. They're not very fast, and they're not great ships to sail on. I certainly would have been seasick all across the Atlantic, no doubt, if I had been on one of these small vessels. 750 tons in the North Atlantic, you're bobbing up and down like a cork right on the water. But certainly good enough to go after U-boats. They're going to devise a lot of these ships. They're going to build sloops of war. They're going to build frigates. They're going to build what are called armed merchant cruisers, which the sailors who sailed on them, they referred to as AMCs. They referred to them as Admiralty-made coffins, right? So they weren't necessarily great ships. But most of the time, the U-boats were not concentrating on the escorts. They were looking to sink the transport vessels. They wanted to avoid the escorts and hit the transport vessels. As they increase the number of escort ships available, and I think the escort ship that's going to be most important are what are known as the destroyer escorts, right? The kind of miniature destroyers, so to speak, that basically have a significant speed that they can run down a U-boat, but also are just loaded with anti-submarine warfare kit. We don't need a lot of 5-inch surface guns, right? We might need just one. Let's load everything up on depth charges and hedgehogs and explosives we can go ahead and launch overboard. And the destroyer escort is going to be an important vessel. They're cheap and they're relatively easy to make, and they can be produced in mass. Certainly by 1943, they have not only enough escorts available to provide a substantial escort to every convoy that is sailing across the Atlantic, but they're going to have enough left over to form these convoy support groups. Think of this like a quick reaction force, right? So basically they're out there, they're hunter-killer groups, and they're just sailing around. They get a call, this convoy's under attack. And the Germans, when they found a convoy, they stuck with it for days, hunting it down. And so this gave the convoy support groups time to get there and lend their weight to the fight. And especially once those convoy support groups arrive, they can focus on going after the U-boats, which means those escorts can go back to escorting the convoy across the ocean and relieve some of that pressure. But let the U-boats reveal themselves to us, and then we'll pounce. And that's the better use of our force overall. So those convoy support groups are going to be really useful. Oh, I pushed the red light, I think. Okay, here we go. All right, technology. Weapons are a big one. Depth charges. Problem with depth charges is they sink relatively slowly. Sonar, early forms of sonar. It's not going to be until 1944 that sonar can start to estimate the depth of a submarine. All right, so it can tell you the range of a submarine, how far out it is, and it can tell you the bearing, which direction it's moving, but it can't tell you how deep it is. So how do you know how to set the fuse on the depth charge to go off at a set time? The other problem is early forms of radar, too, went blind within 200 yards. So if you're approaching a German submarine, that last run-in, before you make your attack run, you lose sight. You're no longer able to catch them on sonar, and to use depth charges, they're launched from the rear of the ship, the aft of the ship. So you had to sail over your target to then launch them. And the Germans use, I can't help but go back to Hunt for Red October here, right? But does everybody remember the Crazy Ivan, right? Or that we're going to turn hard to port or hard to starboard? That's what the German U-boats started doing. The minute they heard an escort ship passing above them, they went one way or they went the other way, because if they stayed on a straight course, they're going to launch all their depth charges in the wrong place. And if they're far enough away, they're not going to have big impact. And no matter what happens, those depth charges explode. And as I showed you on the other, see, I do this in my class too. I start jumping around because I like the pictures, right? It's going to make a big bang, right? It's going to drive up this big plume of water. You don't know if you hit anything unless you see a bunch of debris on the surface, obviously. So one of the things that's going to be devised here is the Hedgehog, which is pictured there. And this is a forward-firing device. So in other words, we're not going to go blind. We can launch these while we still have a sonar contact. One of the things the escorts are going to do as well is they start to tag team submarines. In other words, one will be there to fire the Hedgehog or depth charges. The other will follow along to try and maintain the sonar contact. When you get a depth charge going off, that's going to disrupt your sonar contact, though. These Hedgehogs, not only are they forward firing, not only do they fire up to 24 at a time, giving you a much larger spread and a better chance of hitting the enemy, they only explode on contact. If they hit the sub, they will detonate. Now, it's a smaller charge. They're not as big a charge. They can do damage. They're not necessarily going to cripple a submarine right out. Like a 50 to 100-pound explosive on a depth charge is going to have much greater impact, obviously, on a submarine than one of these. They will start to develop more efficient versions of the Hedgehog. They're going to develop a mortar device that can launch a much larger charge a greater distance to get more explosive capacity. But especially once they get the depth estimating sonar by 1944, it's going to make a lot of these weapons more effective. The other one is aircraft are super effective in anti-submarine warfare. And initially, they're going to be dropping depth charges on subs, but they're going to start to develop what is an air-dropped, acoustic torpedo, which has a built-in, sonar that can go ahead and ping the German submarine and eventually go after it, all right? On the other side, detection. So ASDIC, sonar, and ASDIC stands for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigating Committee, which the British formed in World War I, and they just named it ASDIC. We call it sonar in the United States. And that sonar is going to become more effective. Eventually, they're going to have sonar that is movable, So it's not just forward-facing. They can track ships in different directions. Radar is another one that's going to be important. And for aircraft, radar in the early parts of the war, especially trying to catch German U-boats on the surface. Remember, German U-boat tactics were really designed to avoid the sonar. If we stay on the surface in the dark, they can't see us. Well, now we can see in the dark using radar, And when the German U-boats were making that passage across the Bay of Biscay, this is when times when the British would launch aircraft looking for these ships, and they would use their radar to go ahead and find them, but then they would have to hit them with what's called a Lee light, really bright light, and they tried to depth charge the German U-boat before it sank. They're eventually, the Germans, going to develop a radar detector. It only works, though, on air-mounted radar systems, to avoid aircraft. But the big development here in radar is they're eventually going to develop the Type 271 radar set, which gives you 10-centimeter wavelengths. Again, we're getting very technical here. I'm just going to tell you, other historians have told me this works. I don't know why, but it works. And the way it works is it gives you a much clearer picture. So supposedly, according to all the historians, radar could pick up a periscope on the surface using this 10-centimeter system, whereas previous radars weren't even able to pick up a submarine on the surface within 100 yards because of the surface disturbance of the sea. So that level of detection is pretty important. And also much more advanced, those high-frequency direction finders, called HFDUF. In other words, we can use these to pick up those German radio signals and triangulate. Now, one of the most important things is, too, not only are we going to have more escort vessels, all of these escort vessels by 1943 are going to have all these devices on them. So putting more of this technology onto these ships. And with HFDUF, it's one thing to have land-based radar detection or radio detection, but if you've now got escort vessels with these HFDUF devices, you've got more points of contact, means you can triangulate faster to ultimately find the enemy. All right. Industry, building of the Liberty ships. I tried to find a picture of the Hingham shipyard, but I wasn't able to find them. But, they built a lot of Liberty ships there at the Bethlehem Steel Factory there at the Hingham field. These, I think, are in Portland. But obviously, the Liberty ships, I'm sure everybody knows about these. They're going to have a prefabricated, ships. So they're going to go ahead and build the component parts of these ships all across the United States. So in other words, the shipyards are not so overwhelmed with trying to build these things. We can send this off and build it, so like in Idaho, And then we can go ahead by rail, ship this thing to the shipyard where they'll simply weld it together. They're not going to use rivets. That takes longer, it's more expensive. They're going to weld them together. And that means they can build them faster, and they're going to have basically 3 shifts working around the clock building these vessels, and they're building them to one standard design. And it's actually a British design. All right, it's a British tramp steamer that they go ahead and they pick up this design. And these vessels, the early ones, could go 9 knots, which was pretty good for one of these vessels. They'll eventually get it up to 11, 15. Convoys were usually designated as slow or fast. Slow would go 7 knots, which would have killed me going across the Atlantic at 7 knots, right? That would have been slow. Take forever to get there. Fast convoys went 9 knots. If a ship could make 15 knots or better, it sailed on its own because it can outrun any submarine that's out there. Submarine can make roughly 12 to 15 knots on the surface, 6 to 7 knots when it's submerged. And so if a submarine is not in the perfect position when it happens upon a 15-knot vessel, they're not going to be able to get a shot in. So you can go ahead and run that. But, building these ships and building them faster than the Germans can ultimately sink them. You don't want to lose ships, obviously, but the U.S. production is just going to be absolutely fantastic. In early 1942, the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, sent a message to the President, FDR, and said, it takes 144,000 tons of shipping to move one U.S. infantry division across the ocean. It takes twice that to move one armored division. So if we're envisioning a military that's going to be at least 90 divisions in size, we need a lot of shipping. And so in response to that, in early 42, FDR is going to increase the quotas up to 1.25 million tons of shipping, right, per month. And of course, as we know, the U.S. economy actually outproduces this, And so once that economy starts really getting built up, and having a streamlined system, an assembly line process, means they're building these ships a hell of a lot faster. Sorry, I just shouldn't have said that. I said hell. All right, air power. All right, this is another big one. Early in the war, not a lot of aircraft available, especially flying the distances that are required for anti-submarine warfare. What does fly really far and is pretty effective are 4-engine strategic bombers, which the British Bomber Command did not want to devote to anti-submarine warfare. They wouldn't give them up. They wanted to keep them bombing Nazi Germany. And so early in the war, there aren't enough aircraft available. That mid-Atlantic air gap is that area that really sits far enough away from any land-based air that it's going to be an area of lack of detection. I did read, interestingly, that the convoys, the British developed a system where they would have a catapult-launched aircraft that was a one-time only aircraft. So in other words, you got launched, but they could not recover you. You flew around, and then you ditched in the ocean and hoped somebody was there to pick you up out of the water. I thought, well, that's something right there. That's commitment to the cause. But that's how desperate they were for having these aircraft available. And eventually they're going to do 2 things. Number one, very long-range aircraft will become available in significant numbers. So the Catalina flying boat for the United States, for example. Also the B-24 Liberator bombers. They are not the favored bombers for the bombing campaign over Germany. The B-17 is, but the U.S. is mass producing all types. And so as more of these B-24s, especially they're starting to make 4-engine B-24s available, these are going to become these very long-range aircraft that they're also going to store additional fuel bladders on to go ahead and start to shrink this Atlantic air gap. But eventually they're going to have enough of those small, right, escort carriers on hand. They're going to put U.S. Avenger fighters, torpedo bombers, on board them, and they're going to load them up with depth charges. And basically convoys will have air cover the entire passage across the Atlantic Ocean. And that's why the numbers of tonnage start to drop off and the numbers of U-boat sinkings really starts to increase. By 1943, the middle of 1943, Karl Dönitz becomes commander of the entire Kriegsmarine in January of 43. Hitler got tired of Erich Raeder and told Erich Raeder, you're going to put all your surface ships in harbor and you're going to take the guns off them and you're going to put them on beach fortifications so we can defend against this invasion that we know is coming. Erich Raeder, being a good Navy man, said, you're not taking my ships and my guns, right? He threatened to resign, and Hitler said, thanks, I'll take your resignation. Made Dönitz the commander, and now in 1943, Dönitz can execute the naval strategy he wanted to execute all by himself. And by that point in time, there's enough escorts available, right? The weapon systems are getting better. The detection devices are getting better. The intelligence, right, especially after March of 1943 is now available. And all that's going to be brought to bear, so much so that Karl Dönitz, by the middle of 43, is going to determine that the power of defense in this war has so far outpaced, right, the offensive capability of his U-boats, that he moved his U-boats out of the North Atlantic entirely to go after U.S. shipping in the Central and South Atlantic, right? He was losing too many ships. There was one statistic, the second half of 1943, from June until December of 1943, they sank 57 Allied ships in the North Atlantic, right? And they lost, reverse that. 114 ships and they lost 57 U-boats. That was a level of loss that they could not obviously make up. So a couple of things I want to kind of end on. Operation Deadlight. A lot of these German U-boats are left over, roughly 160, 170. They get turned over to the Allies. Most of them are going to be sunk. Over 100 are simply going to be sunk as part of Operation Deadlight. However, German weapons technology in World War II was pretty significant, pretty sophisticated. This is a Type 21 German submarine. This is a museum ship in Bremerhaven. And this was the type. Only 2 actually went into operation at the end of the war. They were building over 100, but only 2 actually went into combat operations. The unique aspect of this ship is this is more a true submarine than a submersible. So they had the schnorkel device, right, which everybody knows that they developed the schnorkel device that they could still get air to run the diesel engines and stay submerged. This one not only had the schnorkel device, but also they streamlined the hull. It's a much larger submarine than other types, but they streamlined the hull to give it greater underwater speeds. All right. They also increased the number of electric batteries so they could run on electric power for longer and faster. These Type 21s, roughly 30, wound up in the hands of each one of the major allies. So Britain got 30, the US got 30, the Soviet Union got 30. This type is going to be the type that the Soviet Navy is really going to rely heavily on. They're going to improve it, but it's basically based on the German Type 21 type. It's this type and their ability to stay submerged for long periods of time and the way that the Soviets were building them in mass that led the United States Navy to decide we need nuclear propulsion. We need subs that can go faster, can stay underwater longer, and can go deeper so that we can get a tactical advantage over the enemy. So it's this Type 21 design that the Germans basically developed at the end of World War II, gifted to the Soviet Union that the Soviets rely heavily on, that leads the United States to really embrace nuclear propulsion as a way to counter this threat. You know, also the V1, V2 rocket really gives a kickstart, right, a boost to the U.S. Navy's ballistic missile program and helps us start to develop ballistic missiles too. So the German technology at the end of the war was really sophisticated, and that German U-boat design there at the end of the war is going to be the one that's going to kick off the Cold War. So it will continue. That's it. That's all I've got. The Allies won. Should I have I don't have I should have a questions please slide, I guess.
Yeah. Does anybody have some questions?
Does anybody disagree with me? Have I convinced everybody?
Did they have any dummy convoys? Are you aware of?
I'm not aware of dummy convoys because I think shipping was in such high demand that. But the convoy system, part of the purpose of the convoy system was to get the U-boats to reveal themselves and to bring the escorts to bear, against them. So they got to the point that by 1944, even if they had Enigma intelligence that told them a wolf pack wasn't a certain point, they didn't actually sail around it. They sailed the convoy right into those waters. They increased the escorts and they sent the convoy support groups there because they wanted to sink German U-boats. So they got to the point where they were trying to drive those convoys into those waters. So, yeah.
I recall reading that it's one of the big what-ifs of World War II, like what happens if Eric Rader didn't have those materials and he gave it all to U-boats
Yeah.
in 41,
Yeah.
41, like what could have happened?
Yeah. Always difficult to get into counterfactuals because you never know what's going to happen. But yeah, absolutely. But also the Army, the land forces had a huge demand on the German wartime economy as well. So, yeah.
Kind of abstract to your topic, but the Lend-Lease, we got 99-year leases on all these bases. Do we still occupy all those bases?
No, I don't think so.
I don't
No.
think so either.
Especially after the 1990s with the base closures and things of that nature, yeah. It'd be interesting. I'm not even sure how long we held on to them afterwards because I'm not sure all of them were terribly useful, in the long term. So, but I have to look that up, yeah. Yeah.
Is it correct that there was a female command officer that wrote the concept of the
Well, there were a lot of female naval service members. They were called the WRENs, right? The Women's Royal Navy Service, that occupied the submarine tracking room. So yeah, I'm sure there's a really good chance that a woman was in place to go ahead and break some of this information, yeah. But I'm not sure who specifically might have done that or anything like that. A little less on the British side for me.
It was a U.S. Coast Guard woman. Who
Oh, was it?
Terrific at breaking codes in America.
Okay.
And she had cut her teeth breaking the codes of rum runners.
Okay.
And so, yeah, she was really big.
What was her name?
She actually came up with a way of breaking the Enigma code on her own.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a book on her, I forget her name.
Okay. Yeah, the Polish mathematician is Marian Rejewski. He's a man, Marian Rejewski, but that's the one name I'm very familiar with. But yeah. I'm sorry, you had a question, yeah?
Yeah, any idea how many of the Liberty ships and the other freighters that were sunk during running the Merrimack's run to Russia?
Oh, well, there were quite a few. I mean, Liberty ships in particular, no, I'm not sure how many, but that was a... Yeah, they suspended convoys through the Arctic for a while because they were so badly mauled. Because especially in the winter, with the ice sheet moving south, it narrowed the area. And I didn't speak about Operation Drumbeat, the German operations on the Atlantic coast, much as I would have liked, but where they focused was Cape Hatteras, because the ship channel there narrows to like 50 miles. And so they set up right there at Cape Hatteras, which the Civil War historian in me can't help but note also where the Monitor sank in heavy seas during the Civil War. But this was a natural bottleneck, and that's where they were able to get them. So, with the Arctic ice sheets moving down, and I didn't say much about the Arctic convoys only because I kind of see it as it's tangential, to the Battle of the Atlantic, although still important. But for a while, they had to suspend those convoys, and the Soviets were not happy about it.
That picture you got over there too, I remember years ago, I was on the USS Long Beach and we pulled into Bremerhaven and they did an open house.
Oh, yeah.
You want to see the crowd of people that
USS Long Beach, the first guided missile cruiser, nuclear powered, right? Yeah. I'm pretty sure it predates the Enterprise. I think, is it Long Beach?
She beat the Enterprise, she came out first.
Oh, really? Okay. I thought Long Beach came out before. First surface combatant for the U.S. Navy, nuclear
We
powered.
did a race down in the Caribbean with the
Yeah.
Enterprise and we just walked away for her until she finally
Got it revved up, yeah.
And then she wiped it.
Yeah. Yeah.
My mother, and we're from South Jersey,
Mhm.
Atlantic City.
I'm from
area.
Philly.
As a young woman, I think during World War II,
Mhm.
they saw some ships blow up,
Oh, really?
just
Yeah.
like that happened in Florida at that one
Yeah.
nightclub. The
Yeah.
other thing was, the U.S. Army was in charge of surface weaponry.
Okay.
They left all the lights on in New York City.
Oh, right, yeah.
And the Germans just sat out there
Yep.
using their deck guns to sink ships,
Yep.
to save their torpedoes.
Save torpedoes, yeah.
Until they got smart and turned the lights off.
Yeah, and I should have said more about Operation Drumbeat, but I always got to make sacrifices.
Yeah, I read that book.
What your comment just made me think about too is, of course, they had the Type 16, the Milch cows,
Yeah.
which were the refueling subs, the tanker subs. The only thing they could not refuel or rearm was torpedoes. They couldn't move them from one sub to another. So yeah, if the more shells you save or the more you sink with your deck gun, the more torpedoes you can save. Because I think they only carried like 9 or 11 torpedoes
Did
at
they
one
have
point.
areas in the Caribbean where they could go to get refueled?
I'm not sure that they did use that. I mean, I know they moved in the Caribbean after they started a convoy along the Atlantic coast in there, but I'm not sure about friendly countries. South America, yeah. But I think they relied mostly on the milch cows to bring fuel because they could refuel at sea. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a rumor they went to Ireland and got diesel fuel.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because remember Ireland was not really.
Yeah, neutral.
friendly.
Yeah. Interesting.
Never been confirmed.
That was something to check. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I think we had a fantastic day with Dr. Nesters. I'd like to present Dr. Nestor with one of
Oh.
our 20th anniversary
Oh, well,
points.
thank you very much.
And I thank him for coming down to giving us this great program.
Thank you. Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.